Hi class, in this video we are going to be reviewing CSS. So we'll be adding some CSS to the portfolio page that we created in the HTML video. Again, this is going to assume that you have written CSS before and you have some basic familiarity with how it works. But since it is the first video, I will be going over some basics, and I will link to some tutorials and other resources in the video description if you want to brush up on some of the basics of CSS. So if you don't understand everything or if things don't make sense right away, it's not a problem. We can kind of brush up on things, and we can also, review things individually if you need to. So I'm just going to get started, and how I start normally is I'll take my folder and I can drag it over to my text editor. So I have my Sublime text docked over here. You might have it down in the bottom of the window or somewhere else. I can also just open up Sublime and go to File, Open, and just open my folder from my desktop. And again, I'm going to double click to open this up. And so I have my index.html page that we created in the previous video with my projects, and I'm just going to add some basic styles to this so it looks like a real website. And so before I get started with that, let's open up my Sublime server so that we can preview the site. So I'm going to go to Sublime server, and it looks like it's already running. If yours is already running, that's fine. You can stop or start it again, but as long as you see that it's running here, we can just go and open up a new window in Chrome. And again, the link is localhost 8080. You can see it's filling it in for me because I've obviously been there before. And then I'll just click on the class portfolio. So here's what I've got so far. We can see the image and the links, but it doesn't really look like a website yet because we haven't actually added CSS styling to it. So I'm going to open up the inspector as well, just so I have this ready to go. I'm going to increase the size a bit here so it's more visible in the video. And let's get started with some CSS. So we're just going to add some basic styles, just get this to look a bit more like a real website. At the same time, we'll try to review some of the basics of CSS. This isn't going to be comprehensive at all. It'll get us close enough to having a portfolio page. We have to, of course, attach our CSS page to the HTML document. We need some link that tells the browser where to get the CSS page, because it can look for the HTML document, but it's not going to know where to look for the CSS page. So we have to add some new HTML in first, and that is the link tag. So we're going to add in link, and then we use href just like we do with our anchor tags to kind of give a reference to where the file is. So we're just going to call this style.css. I haven't actually created it yet, but when I do create it, that'll be the link. So a couple other attributes I have to add in here are the rel, which is style sheet, the relationship of the page. And then I have to add the type, which is text/CSS. Okay, so that is going to link my style sheet to my page. And so with that set up, now I can create a new file. So I'm going to hit Command N, and I'm going to save this file as style.css. So there's a few different types of styles that we do when we create CSS, and I'm going to go through those in the order that we want to add them to the page. And I'll create some notes in this document to kind of set that up. I didn't really do this in the HTML page because everything was very straightforward. But with the CSS, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some comments. And so you've probably seen comments before if you've ever written any code. A comment is basically just a part of the document that doesn't actually get interpreted by the browser. So I can write whatever I want, and it doesn't affect what the page looks like when you look at it in the browser. So this is a good way to take notes or to add code in that you might take out later or other things like that. In CSS, the way we create a comment is by using a /, an asterisk, and then our comment goes in between. And then we end it by doing another asterisk and another /. In Sublime, I can create this very quickly by doing Command Option and then /, which is obviously the first character in our comment. And so usually that's what I'll do, and I'll write some stuff inside the two asterisks. And I can make this as many lines as I want to if I want to add extra lines here. So the first type of CSS selectors that we're going to look at are generic selectors. Okay, so a selector is basically just a term for an HTML tag that we use to select that element so that we can apply a style to it. So a generic selector is any of our basic tags. So HTML, the head, the body, any div, any paragraph or H1 or list, anything that is just a regular tag, we can use with a generic selector. And any style that we write in CSS is then going to apply to all of the tags. So for example, we usually start with the body. Okay, so this is a generic selector. It's just going to select the body. And when we're writing CSS, we use the selector that we want, and that's followed by two curly brackets. And you know, when you're writing your code, one thing that most of the text editors do at this point is if I hit the first open curly bracket, it actually makes the second curly bracket for me. Some editors won't do this, but most of them will. So that just makes it easier. I don't have to write that second bracket. I can just hit enter and start writing my styles. So the individual styles for CSS go in between the two brackets, and any style that I add is going to affect the body, but it also affects any of the elements that are inside the body as well. So we'll see the effects of that. So with the body section, we can add some generic styles that we want to apply to everything on the page, like our color, background color, the font that we want to use, the font size. All of these things can be set up in the body section. So we have, you know, kind of a boring page with a white background. So let's start with a background color. So with CSS, I can do background-color, okay, and that will set the background color for that specific element. With CSS, your text editor is probably going to help you with this a bit because it's going to remember, you know, what the different rules are and that you need a colon and a semicolon. So Sublime actually did all of that for me, but you might need to write that out yourself. But most of the text editors these days have some sort of like code hinting is what happens when you can see that when I start to write background, it tells me, you know, here are some different properties that you might be looking for. And if I want, I can just click on color and it just makes that semicolon the colon for me, and then I can add a semicolon after I write the rule. So with HTML, I can just add, there's a bunch of colors that I can just add by name. So I can say like blue, and that will make the background blue. Okay, so that doesn't really look very good, in part because there's not a lot of contrast between the blue and the black text, and there's basically no contrast between the blue and these links. So that's not a very good color to choose unless we change some of the other colors. So let's try another color. I won't go too much into HTML color because I assume it's something that you've looked at before, but a website that I really like to use is HTML color codes. I don't remember if it's .com or, yeah. So if you Google HTML color codes, this has all the colors by name and also by hex value or by RGB value. So this is a really good site to use if you're just looking for a color. You can, you know, look at this color picker here, or you can go to the names of the colors and just scroll through by color. So I'll add a link for this page in the YouTube video description as well. But so the blue is a little bit too bright. There's not enough contrast, so there's not enough difference between our text and our background. So let's try light blue and see if that looks a bit better. Okay, so now we can actually kind of see the text and stuff. So that looks much better. So we'll stick with that for now. Feel free to add your own color. And so now that we've actually added a style, this is our first style, you can see in the inspector, if we click on the body section and then look down here at the styles, you can see that background color that we added. And using Chrome or probably some of the other browsers, I can also, you know, play with this color and see if there's maybe some other options that might be, you know, closer to what I'm really going for. And then I can copy the color from there and put it in my code. But this only is like a preview in Chrome. When I refresh the page, it goes back to what I have in my actual text document over here. Okay, so the background color is very specific. One thing that's a little confusing with CSS, and you'll see that there's some rules that have confusing names, is that for the text color, I just use the word color. So background color is specifically for the background, but for the color of the text, it's just color. So if I wanted to change the color here, maybe to like white, it just uses the word color. And it affects some other things. You can see it affected these little dots on my list are now white. So it's not just the text, but it's primarily the text color. So I'm just going to put a little comment here that says text color. That's another way that you can use comments, is you can actually put it at the end of a line. So it just comments on this specific line. And then I'm going to choose a different font family. So I won't go into a ton of detail here, but I can use the font family rule. And then there's a lot of different ways to add fonts. You've probably used Google Fonts and other things like that before. I'm going to use a web-safe font just so I don't have to like load anything else into this website. So I'm going to Google web-safe fonts, and I'll add a link to this as well. And I'm just going to look for something. So here's some web-safe fonts. So these are just fonts that are supported by all of the different browsers. And we know there's a lot of different browsers now. There's different for Windows and Mac, and there's different levels of support. So you do want to make sure that your font that you choose is supported on many different computers. And if it's not, then you want to make sure you have a backup font that is supported. So I'm going to look through these fonts, see if I can find something that I like. I kind of like this one. It's kind of computery, so I'm going to choose this. So I'm just going to copy that Andel Mono, and I'm going to load it. And that works. So that I'm happy with the way that looks. I might want to take a look at one of these references. And I can see here that the compatibility for Windows is actually very low. It's 4%, whereas it's 95% for Mac. So there's a good chance that if I put this on a Windows machine, that you won't see that font. So I can look at the font stack here, and it gives me some other options. So this Andel Mono, so monospace would be kind of the fallback font, which it looks like is, well, it doesn't actually say whether it's accepted, but I think it is accepted by Windows. So I'm going to put a comma here and put monospace. And so if Andel Mono is not available, like on a Windows machine, then it will default to the next font in my what's called a font stack, which is going to be that monospace. So that way I know that it's not going to default to like Times New Roman or something like that. So there's a lot more to talk about with font and color, but we don't really have time for that today. So I'll link to some other resources for that. So let's continue with our page. We've got a couple of nice colors going on. We can continue with some of our generic tags. So other than the body, another generic tag we have is the H1. I don't think I really need to change anything with the H1 at the moment. I think it's probably fine the way it is. But our next generic tag is this unordered list. And you can see there's a couple defaults here that I'm not super happy with, so I kind of want to just get rid of them. So one is, you can see when I inspect in Chrome, the green section on the left is the padding, which allows for those two dots. I don't really want that, so I'm going to get rid of that. And then there's the orange on the top and the bottom is the margin. I don't really need that either for the way that I'm going to lay this out later, so I'm going to get rid of that as well. When I click on the list item, there's a default display, which is it adds this dot, so I'm going to get rid of that as well. So I'm just going to do a UL. That's another generic tag. And I'm going to say margin is 0 and padding is 0. So you've probably done this before if you've ever written any CSS. It kind of gets rid of some of this stuff that we don't want. And then I'm going to do the list item, and I'm just going to say list style is none. So that'll get rid of those dots. So that looks a little bit better. I'm also going to come up with a generic color for my links. I actually don't mind this blue. But what I want is a hover style. So in order to do that, I need to have my anchor tag, and I'm just going to leave the color as blue. I actually kind of am fine with that, so that's going to stay the same. But then I'm going to add a pseudo selector. So this is still a generic selector, but it's also a pseudo selector. And what that means is that it's selecting a state for our anchor tag that only happens once the user is interacting. So I'm going to say user interacts. And so for that one, it's a and then colon hover. So this is specifying when the user is hovering over our anchor tag. And I'm just going to change the color. So let's change the color. Something that's like kind of the opposite of blue is like maybe orange or red. So maybe we can try that and see how that looks. It looks okay. It's kind of hard to tell. Maybe it's something a little darker. Let me see what values I have for orange. Maybe I'll try orange red so it's a little bit darker. Oh well, that's all capitalized when I copied that. I don't think that makes a difference, but since everything else is lowercase, I'm just going to do lowercase. Okay, that stands out a lot better. I'm going to keep it like that. I'll probably increase the font size of these in a bit, but for now I'll just leave that. So now it changes color when I hover over it. But if I want this to be even a little bit more fancy, I can animate that color change. And to do that, I need to add it to the original tag, not the pseudo selector. If I put it in the pseudo selector, it's only going to animate when it changes to the color. It's not going to animate back. And so to make that animation, I'm just going to do a little transition, and I'm going to choose the color, and I have to choose a duration. So it doesn't have to be that long. I'm going to say like 200 milliseconds. So very short, like less than a second. And then I can also do what's called easing. I won't go into this too much, but it basically means that it starts a little slower and then it speeds up. So I'm going to say ease-in. So that's a basic transition, and you can see now that it actually animates that color change, which is kind of nice. It's not, you know, it's pretty fast. It's a little bit subtle, but it is perceptible, so it kind of makes it a bit nicer. Now we're going to work with some IDs in classes. So that's another type of selector. We have the ID for specific parts of our document. So I have the container, I have the header section, and the portfolio section. So we're going to start adding some rules there, which are actually going to really affect the layout rather than the color and typography. So I'm going to do some ID and class selector examples down here. And this is typically the order you want to go in. You start with your generic selectors, then you move to ID and class, and then you move to more specific selectors. So the first thing I'm going to start with is the container. You're going to see, you'll probably think this is very familiar because you've probably done this before, but I'm going to do hashtag for ID and then container. And so I'm just going to start with a bit with the layout here. So to make my layout, the first thing I want to do is set a width for the page. There's a lot of different ways that you can do this, but I'm going to start with the width being 960 pixels. This is a really good place to start because it's not too big, it's not too small, and 960 is easy to divide up into different sections. So you can divide it by 3, you can divide it by 2, you can divide it by 4, you can divide it by 6, you can divide it by 8, you can divide it by 12. It's very easy to divide into different sections. So I'm going to start with the width is 960, and that's not really going to change anything. You'll see that when I kind of move the browser here, now it's not going to change the layout. But then the thing that is going to make things a little bit different is I'm going to add some margins to the side. You've probably seen this before, margin 0 auto. That basically says put 0 margin on the top. Okay, so the top up here and the bottom. And then it says put auto margin on the left and right. So if I have auto margin here and here, what that does is it calculates the difference between the size of the page and the size of the browser, and then it divides it between the two. So when I refresh this, now my page is going to be centered. And it doesn't quite look centered because we're not done with the layout, but you can see when I hover over here, over the container, the orange margin on the left and the orange margin on the right are about the same size. So that's a good way to center our page. One thing that does create an issue with is that as we get smaller, the page isn't going to change. So instead of just plain width, something I can do is put max width here. So max obviously is short for maximum, or the maximum or highest value that the page can have. And so now instead of changing, it's going to shrink here. Oh, and then actually this brings up another generic tag that I want to use. So the last generic tag I want to use, which I forgot, is my images. I want to set their width to be 100%. So instead of setting a pixel number of width, if I say 100%, it's going to change with the size of the browser. So if I say width is 100%, so now my images are going to stretch to fill that space. So they get smaller when the browser is smaller, they get larger when the browser is larger. And then the last thing I want to do besides the max width is the minimum width. So if I get down here really small, all of a sudden my images are like, very small. I don't want them to get that small. So I'm going to set a minimum width, maybe somewhere around 320, which is 1/3 of our total page. And that'll be good. So that way, once we get down that small, it's not going to get any smaller. So I'm going to say the min width, and this is still for the container, is 320 pixels. Okay, so now it's got kind of like the smallest value that it'll go to. Okay, so that's my container. So now we can add styles to the next two sections, the header and the portfolio. I'm going to do a little bit of advanced layout stuff here. And it's going to probably be new to most of you guys. But it's actually, even though you haven't seen it before, it makes things a lot more simple than what you may have seen in the past. So I'm going to be using a couple more advanced CSS techniques here to do the layout. And we're not going to really be spending a lot of time on this, and you probably won't need to use this at all for the rest of the semester, but it is going to make our page layout look much better. So we'll just do that quickly, and if you have questions, we can always go over it later. So I'll just do a few rules here. So let's start with our header section. What I want to do is I've got my title, that looks fine, I don't need to change that, but I want to do something with my navigation over here. And what I really want to do is I want to kind of put it over here on the opposite side of the title so that, we can frame our page. So I'm going to go after the container and I'm going to do my header section. I'm going to use a really new special kind of CSS layout, which is called flex. So I'm going to say display is flex. And just by changing that one rule, you're going to see that now, instead of going from one line to the next, which is how CSS usually goes, it usually goes one element, the next element, the next element. You can see that with our images, which are block display. It just goes one after the other. With flex display, it moves things into with flex display, it moves things into a horizontal space. So I have my H1 and then my UL. And then because it's flex, it's very easy to change the layout. So one of the rules with flex is how we want our content to fit on the page. And that rule is the justify content rule. And I'm going to preview this in Chrome so you can see some of the options. So center is it centers everything. End is the left side. Flex end is the right side. Then there's space around. So it adds some space over here, here, and here. There's space between, which pushes them away from each other. And then there's also space evenly, which adds an even amount of space in between all the elements. So what I'm going to do is space between. This works with these two elements because I just have the H1 and the UL. And so that way they're spaced evenly and we have all the space in here. If you had more elements like a logo or other navigation elements, you might need to change that. But for this, that's all we really need. And then one last thing is I want these to line up. And so I go back to my header section. And so I can also change the alignment with the align items rule. So if I do baseline, they're going to try to kind of be aligned this way. There's a margin on this, so we may need to fix that, but we will do that later. There's center, which is going to center them in the page. And then there's some other rules, but I think what we'll go with is either baseline or center. So I'm going to add those here. I'm going to say justify content, and we can see it's being filled in. So I'm going to say space dash between. And feel free to play around with these and do something differently if you prefer a different look. And then I'm going to do align items. And I'm going to start with center, but I might need to change this. Okay, so now that actually looks pretty decent. If we look at our header, there's our H1, there's our menu. And that actually looks pretty good the way it is. But one thing I might want to do is with this UL, I might want to put these guys next to each other. So what I can do is I can just use another flex display inside of a flex display. And so this is going to get us to another type of selector that we haven't covered yet, but it's an important one. This is the nested selector. Okay, so I don't want to add this to my generic UL because I might add lists in the future that I don't want to have nested display or flex display. But if I specify, if I say header space UL, that's only going to target a UL that's inside of a header. It's called nested. It's like a bird's nest, like you have your eggs inside of the nest. Okay, so anything that's inside of something else is called nested. And the way that we specify that is just by using a space. So we start with the element, and then this is the element that's inside of the first element. So any UL that's inside of a header, right? If we close the header, you don't see the UL anymore. If I open the header, there's that UL. Okay, so that's a nested selector. And so this rule will only apply to our header list. So I'm going to say here flex, or sorry, display is flex as well. And so now we've got our two parts are next to each other. They are sitting directly next to each other, so there's a few different ways we can fix that. The easiest way to do it is just to give them both a little margin. So I can say header li, so another nested selector, and say margin. We're going to want to do on the left, and I'll just say 1 EM. So now they're separated a little bit. And the other thing now we see is that they are still centered, which looks okay. But if we change this to baseline, now we're going to see that this is on a line like this, which I think is better. And then I'm also going to increase the size of these a bit. So I'm going to say header and then anchor tag. And I'm going to increase the font size. So I'll say the font size is maybe 1.5 EM. Okay, so that looks a little bit better. Quick review on the EM. That's just a default unit. So whatever the font size for the body is what the font size is, what 1 EM is. So if the font size is 16, 1 EM is 16 pixels, and 1.5 EM is 16 plus half of that, which is 8. So that's 24 pixels. So it's just a relationship. It's just a unit that changes depending on your base font size. So it's a good unit to use because you can just use like 1 or 2, and they'll be relative to everything else on the page. Okay, so that's my header section, and that is flex display. So it's just a few rules, but it's very powerful. So if you've used like float or tables in the past, this is a much better way to do this. It's a little bit newer. It's only been around for a few years, and there's a lot more detail that goes into it. I'll link to some tutorials that you can take a look at. But since we're just setting up this portfolio page, we're not going to be using this a ton throughout the semester. I figured this would be a nice way to set it up. Okay, so let's look at our portfolio section now. It actually doesn't look so bad with these like big images and then these links down here. But we can use a different type of layout for the portfolio that will kind of create the look of a portfolio. And there's a few different ways to do this. But what I'm going to use is called the CSS grid. So let's go down after our header and we'll do our portfolio section. And for this one, it's pretty similar in some ways to the Flexbox, but the Flexbox is really for laying out like one section across. The grid is really more for doing like a full layout. So you might have rows and columns. For today, we're only going to see columns, but as we add more projects, we'll be able to add more rows. So for this portfolio one, I'm going to say display is grid. And that's not going to change anything right away because we haven't specified how many columns we want. So now we can specify how many columns we want in the grid by saying grid-template-columns. It's kind of a long rule, but it does a lot of stuff. And so we can basically just set the number of columns we want here. And we're going to use a special unit here called the fractional unit. This basically just divides up the space evenly. So if I say 1FR and then just add to it. So if I say 1FR, that's just one column. If I say 1FR space 1FR, that's 2 columns. So now you can see there's 1, 2 columns. And it kind of lays everything out with that. If I add another one, then we get 3 columns. And I could keep going. If I add another one, that's 4 columns. But now we're running out of space for our content. So let's just leave it at 3 columns for now. And since we only have 3 projects, we only have 1 row. But as we add more projects, there'll be more rows. So that's the easiest way to make columns. You can also use like specific numbers here. So for example, if I said 200 pixels for the first column, then our first column is going to be smaller. Our second 2 columns will change to fill that space. That might be useful for a different style of layout, but for us, we want them all to be even. So I'm just going to use FR for each one. So again, FR just means fraction unit. And so it just divides the space evenly into 3. So then we don't want our columns to be touching each other necessarily. So a way to fix that is with our grid gap. And I'm just going to use 1EM for the grid gap. So we have a little spacing there. So that looks a bit nice. And so we can already see with just a few rules, we have a much more portfolio looking website. We didn't really have to do a whole lot to get there. So the grid and the flexbox are very convenient for doing that layout. It's really not a lot of CSS on this page. So our last type of selector that we're going to look at is our class selector. So we have these 3 different project sections and we want to apply the same styles to them. And so we're going to use a class instead of an ID. And to use a class, we just use the dot and then the name of the class. So we're going to say dot project. And so we can add a few different styles here. So, you know, one thing is we might want to add like a border. So we can say border. I'm going to use a multiple rule border. So I'm going to say like 1 pixel solid. Let's say blue. Or actually, let's use the orange that I used earlier. What was that? Orange red. I'm going to put that in there. Okay. So, you know, right now, it doesn't really look that good because it's touching directly on the image. So there's no space here. So we can look at the box model real quick. So if you remember, you've probably covered this before. Okay, so let's review the box model for CSS. Okay, so let's consider one of these guys as our element. So in the middle of the element, we have the content. So for this case, that's the image and the link. And then we have a border around the content. Okay, so that's the border. And then between the content and the border is the padding. And then between the outside of the border and other elements is the margin. So if we want to add space in between our content, the image, and this border, we need to use the padding. So let's go ahead and add that in here. So I'll say padding is 1EM. Okay, and you can see that that shrinks the image because we're pushing the content inside. And so let's actually increase the border since we have this like brighter font. Okay, so that looks pretty good. And then let's actually make the font for the project links a bit bigger as well. So we'll say project. We're going to use another selector, nested selector here, the anchor tag. So I'm going to do the font size. And I'm going to do not quite as big as the menu, but 1.25 EM. Make that a little bit bigger. Okay, so that looks good. And so it's nice because when we hover over the link, it matches that border. Okay, and then let's actually add in a background. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use another pseudo tag, but this time it's on the class rather than the anchor tag. So I'm going to say project hover. So you can really add a pseudo tag on anything you want to. So I'm going to change the background color. Let's just change it to white just as an example. So now if I hover over here, it's going to change to white. Okay, so we can kind of see, that kind of helps us highlight where we are. It adds a little bit more contrast to the image, so that's kind of nice. And then we can actually add a transition here as well. We need to transition from something, so since we don't have a color, what I can do is set the background color as transparent. So this is a little bit of a trick. So if I want to animate to the background color, but without using a different background color, I can just set it to transparent, and then I can set that transition like we did earlier. So let's do background color. So we're going to transition the background color. We'll also do 200 milliseconds, and we'll also do ease in just to match our other transitions. And so now we have a nice little animation as we hover over our different sections. The last thing I want to do is just add the style to my about page. So when we go to about, we don't see those styles anymore. And that's because we duplicated this page before we actually had the link. So this is a good time to review. What I want to do is copy this link to my style sheet. So I'm going to grab that and hit Command C and then go to About. And I'm just going to paste this in here under the meta tag. And so now when I reload this page, now we get this nice style. But the problem now is that this portrait that I added is very large. So that's why I put an ID. So we can style this individually. And then we can also style the paragraph down here. And so I'm going to go back to style.css, and I'm going to add a section called About, just so I know that that's what I'm styling. And so here's my portrait. And I'm going to make this a bit smaller. So I'm going to say like the width is 200 pixels. Okay, that's a decent size. And then I'm going to use float to the right. You could also use left. This is just an example I want to use of how to actually use float correctly. The only time you should really use a float is when you're positioning an image around some text. Okay, so for years in CSS, we used the float property in order to do layouts because we didn't have other better ways to do it. But now that we have the CSS grid and the flexbox, we should really avoid using floats, except for this specific case where we're floating the image around the text. So we don't really have enough text to see that, but if I make this smaller, you can see as the text gets smaller, the image kind of fits around it. So that's really what the float is used for. You shouldn't use it anywhere else. So then I'm also going to say about, and then the paragraph. I'm going to make the font size here like pretty big, just so it's very readable. Okay, so now we can see how the float works. And so that can be, that's my about page. So now I have the home page and the about page. And so yeah, that's it for CSS. Again, this is not comprehensive at all. There's a lot of stuff that we just kind of barely scraped. So I'll add a bunch of links to tutorials and other things to look at if you need more review. However, as I mentioned before, this class really isn't so much about HTML and CSS as it is about JavaScript. So we'll be moving on next week to really focusing on JavaScript. And so as long as you've got your portfolio in a place that you're happy with, you don't really have to worry about doing too much HTML or CSS for this course specifically. But if you do have questions or you do want to try to work on things, I'm happy to go over anything in class or on our own time.